Silence is often misunderstood as weakness, hesitation, or lack of confidence. But in reality, it is one of the most powerful psychological tools you can use in any social interaction. Because while most people are busy filling space with words, trying to prove themselves, justify their thoughts, or avoid awkwardness, the person who is comfortable with silence immediately stands out. Not because they are louder or more expressive, but because they are more grounded, more controlled, and more intentional. And this is where the power of silence begins, because silence creates contrast, and contrast draws attention. And when everyone else is talking, the person who pauses, who listens, and who speaks only when necessary automatically commands more presence, because the human brain is wired to notice what is different, and in a noisy environment, stillness feels significant. And this is why silence often gets interpreted as confidence, because it signals that you are not dependent on constant validation or approval to feel secure in a conversation. And that sense of independence makes people more curious about you, more attentive to what you might say next, and more likely to assign value to your words. And this ties directly into the psychology of scarcity, where things that are less frequent are perceived as more valuable. So when you speak less but with intention, your words carry more weight, because they are not diluted by unnecessary noise and beyond perception. Silence also gives you control, because in any interaction, the person who reacts less has more influence. And when you resist the urge to respond immediately, to defend yourself, or to fill every gap in conversation, you create space to observe, to think, and to choose your response rather than being driven by impulse. And that pause, even if it lasts only a few seconds, shifts the dynamic, because it shows that you are not easily affected, and emotional control is one of the strongest signals of psychological strength. And people naturally respect those who appear composed under pressure. And this is especially powerful in situations of conflict or negotiation, where silence can create tension in a way that words cannot. Because when you stop responding, the other person is left alone with their own thoughts, often leading them to over-explain, reveal more information, or even adjust their position just to break the discomfort. And in this way, silence becomes a tool for influence, not by forcing an outcome, but by allowing the natural dynamics of human psychology to unfold. And this is something that skilled communicators and leaders understand deeply, because they know that not every moment needs to be filled with words, and that sometimes the most impactful thing you can do is simply pause, maintain eye contact, and let the moment breathe. And another layer to this is the role of silence in listening. Because true listening is not just about hearing words, it's about being fully present. And when you are silent in a conversation, not waiting for your turn to speak, but genuinely paying attention, it creates a sense of validation for the other person, making them feel understood and respected. And this strengthens connection and trust, because people are drawn to those who make them feel heard. And ironically, by speaking less, you often become more influential, because your presence becomes associated with clarity and intention rather than noise. And silence also protects you from saying things you might regret, because many of the words people wish they could take back are spoken in moments of emotional reaction. And by allowing yourself a moment of silence, you create a buffer between stimulus and response, which is where self-control lies. And this is why silence is not passive, it is active restraint. It is the decision to remain composed rather than reactive. And that decision communicates strength more clearly than any argument or explanation ever could. And at the same time, silence can be used strategically to create emphasis, because when you pause before or after a key statement, it gives your words space to land, making them more memorable and impactful. And this is why effective speakers often use pauses deliberately, not because they forgot what to say, but because they understand that timing is just as important as content. And this brings us to an important distinction, which is that powerful silence is not the same as awkward silence. Because awkward silence comes from discomfort and lack of presence, while powerful silence comes from calmness and control, and people can feel the difference immediately, even if they can't explain it. And this is why developing comfort with silence is less about technique and more about mindset. Because when you stop seeing silence as something to avoid and start seeing it as something to use, your entire approach to communication changes. You stop rushing, you stop over-explaining, and you start choosing your words with intention. And this shift not only changes how others perceive you, but also how you perceive yourself. Because the more comfortable you become with silence, the more you realize that you don't need to constantly prove your value through words. And that realization creates a sense of internal stability that naturally reflects outward, making your presence feel stronger and more grounded. And ultimately, the power of silence comes down to one simple principle, which is that what you don't say can often be more impactful than what you do say. Because silence creates space, and in that space, attention grows, tension builds, and meaning becomes clearer. And once you understand how to use silence intentionally, you realize that communication is not just about speaking. It's about timing, presence, and control. And once you see how powerful silence can be, you can't unsee it.